Hello everyone, and welcome to an essay video series by yours truly, the Sea Monster. For this series, I will be talking about Monster Hunter, the 2020 film from writer-director Paul W.S. Anderson based on the video game franchise of the same name. Now, the way I'm going to tackle this movie is as someone who, as of this series, hasn't played any of the Monster Hunter games, yet is familiar with certain elements from said games, as well as someone who is generally familiar with Anderson's body of work. Now, I did do a video on this film before, although it was more of a rant than anything, which was made shortly after I finished watching it. So, for this series, I would like to try to make things as PG as possible, or PG-13 at least, by going at this film in a more calm approach as opposed to the rage-filled approach that I made in that previous video. I will be discussing the film at length, spoilers and all, so there's the warning out there for anybody who would like to familiarize themselves with the film before proceeding any further. The discussion will be intended to assess the film's objective quality, with my personal views on it to only chime in where it's applicable. And then, by the end of this series, a conclusion will be made and reached and presented on the film's overall quality. I will be going on tangents at certain points throughout this series, but they will tie into as well as support whatever points I will be making. So, now that I have properly introduced this series to you all, let's step right into the dimension that is Paul W.S. Anderson's Monster Hunter, and begin. To start things off, let's briefly go over the plot of Monster Hunter 2020. As much as people out there would like to joke about a film by someone like Paul W.S. Anderson having a plot mainly because, well, he's one of those filmmakers who makes movies that put more emphasis on visual spectacle instead of the fundamentals of storytelling. Nonetheless, there is a plot in Monster Hunter, even if it is rather light in terms of depth. But we'll get to that later. The plot essentially follows a United Nations operation run by Captain Artemis, played by Mila Jovovich, Paul W.S. Anderson's real-life wife, that has responded to a distress signal from Bravo Team, who seems to have disappeared out of the blue. Artemis and her team then find themselves suddenly teleported to another world, where big creatures roam. When her team gets wiped out by such creatures, like the Diablos, a ground-burrowing monster, and giant insectoid creatures, Artemis is then rescued by and eventually allies herself with a hunter, played by Tony Jaa, in order to find a way to get back home. Now, that seems like a pretty simple premise. Perhaps one could call it dirt simple. But a very simple premise isn't inherently a bad thing. A movie like this doesn't necessarily need to have a deep or complex story, but much like a movie that's trying to be deep or complex, it does need to be effectively executed. In fact, there have been plenty of films out there about an armed force or mercenary operation being wiped out by deadly forces beyond what they're prepared for, with only one person remaining who has to persevere and adapt in order to survive. A good and even classic example of this is the 1987 film Predator. The thing that is key here, that is the reason why Predator works and why Monster Hunter doesn't, is because Predator opted to have us get to know its characters in terms of who they are, their relationships with one another, and how they respond to the threat of being hunted by the Predator before they get systematically killed off one by one. It's almost even at an intimate level, with Arnold Schwarzenegger's character Dutch eventually being left as the last man standing. Over the course of that film, we see how certain events and character deaths allow us to get an idea of who these people are, as well as see them change over the course of the film. And even when some characters make a fatal mistake or an irrational decision, it still lines up with who they are and how such events or deaths have impacted them on a personal level. The problem with Monster Hunter isn't so much that it doesn't have complex characters or an underlying message, theme, what have you. The problem is that the very simple story and characters that the film does have are either badly done, underwritten, or have wasted potential in terms of what's been established about them. What little there is, of course. Artemis's team is all killed off within the first 20 minutes of the film, which by that point we barely even have an idea of who they are as people. We do get a sense of camaraderie from them when they're singing an army ballad during a drive through the monster desert, but we never get to know any of these characters as people before they start biting the dust. Again, referring back to Predator, the characters there don't start getting picked off one by one until about a little over a third of the way through the film's 100-minute long running time, after it has spent that time having us get to know its characters just enough to where we genuinely care about them once the Predator starts hunting them. Now imagine if Paul W.S. Anderson remade Predator, and he had the Predator come right out the gate and slaughter Dutch's entire team within the first 20 minutes, leaving Dutch as the lone survivor who has to spend the rest of the movie evading and fighting the Predator. I can only imagine the dip in quality the film would take if that were the case. Since Anderson appears to be a fan of the Alien and Predator films, to where he went on to make an Alien vs. Predator film back in 2004, surely he wouldn't think to make my hypothetical scenario a reality. I hope. Now, going back to Monster Hunter, Artemis' team exists primarily for the film to have a body count, like it's a slasher movie, and that's it. And believe me when I say that there are slasher movies out there, like Halloween and Scream, which have characters who actually come off as real people who have some level of depth or development, more so than the characters in Monster Hunter. The film also does a poor job at handling tone, placing awkward moments of humor during scenes that are supposed to be drenched with intensity and suspense, thus affecting one's overall investment in what's happening because the viewer is left confused as to how they're supposed to feel during such a scene. Referring back to the scene where Artemis and her team are singing an army ballad while driving through the desert, which I would like to point out is an example of shoddy writing in the film, because that scene takes place almost immediately after they find what remains of Bravo Team, who the film makes a conscious effort to show have been burnt to ash, to where one of the soldiers even addresses that the sand had been turned into glass. They also make an acknowledgement that whatever caused this carnage may also still be out there, which puts them all in a state of uneasiness. Now, an argument could be made that the singing scene is there so that the team would be kept together and to maintain their prowess, sort of to keep their heads straight. But considering that they're in a totally foreign environment and they have no idea what killed Bravo Team or where it is, this comes off as a cheap way for the film to establish camaraderie amongst the team right before they all start becoming monster chow, and it doesn't line up logically with how a group of soldiers would deal with unusual circumstances. Now, if Artemis and her team did their a cappella bit before they got teleported into the monster world, then at least it would make a little more sense for them to do this, because they're about to go on what may very well be to them standard procedure. But as it is, the army ballad a cappella moment meant well, yet it was badly done in execution and happened at a very awkward point in the film. Now, let's talk about the main character of the film, Captain Artemis. Artemis is, for the most part, a blank slate. Much like Alice from the Resident Evil movies, a franchise also based on a series of video games that Mila Jovovich also starred in and collaborated with her husband on. Artemis is thrusted into a dangerous environment where she has to brave through its various perils and adapt in order to survive. This is very much similar to how the character of Alice started out in the first Resident Evil movie. Except I would even say that Alice, even when she is shown to have skills and abilities that not even the most well-trained soldiers present in the film have, there is at least an established reason for her to have such capabilities, as she had the T-virus, which, in the films, mutates people and things into one of three things as we see throughout that franchise: zombies, mutant monsters, or, in rare instances, superhumans. Sure, the Resident Evil movies that would come after the first movie would muddle whatever mythology was present regarding Alice and how the T-virus works, but at least in the case of the first film, Alice did have capabilities that she would learn about over the course of the film. Plus, there was a level, no pun intended, of intrigue regarding the mystery of her role in the events leading up to the film that we would learn about over time. Meanwhile, we have Captain Artemis, who the most we get in terms of backstory and of what kind of character she's presented as is a wedding ring that she carries with her that we see on occasion, detailing the possibility of her being a widow, a character trait that Tony Jaa's Hunter character also appears to have in common with her, based on small statues that he seemed to have made that appeared to be of an adult and children, which he prays over during nighttime in some scenes. There's an implication that he had a wife and children who died off screen. If the film was well written and had elaborated more on these details, it would have taken advantage of the opportunity to have Artemis and the Hunter form a bond over an understanding of how they both lost someone whom they loved, with, for example, Artemis having lost her husband during war, and the Hunter losing his family to a monster, perhaps even a certain Rathalos. That way, we could have something to understand about these characters, and to even be endeared by them in some way. But no. Instead, the film spends so much time on horribly edited fight scenes between them and having them bond after Artemis gives the Hunter a chocolate bar. Right. Aside from all that, though, Artemis may as well be a blank slate, and the same can be said about the Hunter due to the wasted potential there is in having him be a character with any sort of depth to him. And as far as the rest of the characters in the film go, they're all either side characters that can be interchangeable, like the ones who were accompanying the Hunter during the prologue of the film where he's thrown off a ship in the desert while it was being attacked by a Diablos, or characters that are literally here just to die, as in the characters who were accompanying Artemis at the beginning of the film. Meanwhile, you have Ron Perlman's character, the Admiral, who is just there to give exposition about the gateway between the monster world and Artemis's world, as well as the Rathalos that guards the gateway. This exposition doesn't come until the last third of the film, and is so ham-fisted in that odds are the film would have been better off without it, or even better, had the exposition come earlier in the film. If Paul W.S. Anderson had focused on giving us a better idea of what this world is, rather than, like I said, spending so much time on badly edited action sequences, then we could have had something instead of a desire for the movie to simply end already. Other than that, there's really nothing that stands out about the Admiral other than his terrible hair design, which makes him look like Cloud from the Final Fantasy series if he reached his 70s and became a hobo. Granted, this design is based on how this particular character looks in the Monster Hunter games, but the way this character design is executed still makes it appear uncanny when translated into live action. On the one hand, it is accurate to the games, but on the other hand, just because something is accurate to certain source material, that doesn't mean it will translate well from one medium to another. If the film, at the very least, had downplayed the look of the Admiral's hair, then perhaps it would look less ridiculous, and certainly would make him look less like a Dragon Ball Z knockoff. Now, that is not the only issue regarding this costume design. Another big issue with it is that it presents a juxtaposition with how gritty the film had been up to this point, even though the games have been considered to be more like swashbuckling and adventurous. In case anybody is to bring this to my attention, yes, I will address the Palico in the movie regarding the juxtaposition between this film's tone and certain things that are presented in it that were from the games. But that will be a point for me to make in the next part. Now, you may be wondering, why is this guy going on about Ron Perlman's hair in this film? Well, that's because there's so little else to say about his character due to his very limited screen time that it just allowed me to make a point about the film's costume design, which isn't terrible overall aside from, like I said earlier, the way Ron Perlman's character looks. I don't really have that much of an issue with Mila Jovovich's character's costume design in terms of the armor that she puts on later on in the film or how Tony Jaa's character looks. So, yeah, I don't have that much of an issue with the costume design aside from Ron Perlman's character. Like, just get rid of the hair, man. You could just do away with it. So to sort of wind things down from discussing the characters in Monster Hunter, let's move on to something else that may not seem like a big issue at first glance, only to be something that is a bit bothersome. The film opens with a card of text which features a quote. The quote reads as follows: "It is entirely possible that behind the perception of our senses, new worlds are hidden of which we are totally unaware." Now you may be wondering, why is this a problem? There have been plenty of films that open up with a string of text, either to establish the world that the story will be taking place in order for the viewer to understand what is going on, such as in the opening crawls from various Star Wars films, or text that features a quote that ties into the story in a thematic sense. The opening quote for Monster Hunter 2020 is attempting to do the latter. However, it doesn't succeed in gaining the film any sort of nuance, nor does it even relate to any character's experience throughout it. If anything, the quote comes off as a feeble attempt on Paul W.S. Anderson's part to try to make the film seem like more of a sci-fi epic than it really is, or to try to have the film pretend like its plot has more going on beneath the surface than what's actually there. Which is to say that there isn't much beneath the surface at all. It would have been better to just not have this text card in the film at all, because at least by doing so, the film would appear as if it's accepted the fact that it's nothing more than a mindless, disposable action film. Therefore, I probably wouldn't even feel the need to do this essay video series, although, granted, that may not exactly be a guarantee, because if you just took out the text but not change anything else, yeah, I'd probably still do this essay video series anyways, because I'd have a lot more to say than just that the text in the movie that comes up at the opening is stupid. So if this opening text was left out completely, then the film probably could have been improved at least slightly, even in the most baseline sense imaginable. But no. Since this is a movie based on a video game directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, we gotta have the film include something stupid right from the word go, even when it's completely unnecessary. Much like how Resident Evil The Final Chapter started with a backstory that was completely contradictory with what came before, and I might add that Paul W.S. Anderson wrote all 6 of these movies, so you would think someone who's been writing and directing most, if not all, movies in a certain franchise would keep track of continuity and what kind of story he's trying to tell and what he's established throughout a certain series, but no. Anyways, that's a digression for sure. But, yeah, much like Resident Evil The Final Chapter, Monster Hunter has to start off with something stupid, like a quote that doesn't really mean anything in the context of its story. Also, it's pretty redundant to say that we would be unaware of new worlds that are hidden. If a world is new to us and is hidden, then by default, we would be unaware of it. That's like saying that the planet of Mars is undiscovered because we don't have the means to see it for ourselves, thus making us unaware of its existence. While the misuse of a quote as an opener may not be the film's most egregious offense, it's still not a very good way to start a film. So, that's gonna have to be enough for this part. I'd like to thank you all for watching this one, and I hope to see you all in part 2, where I'll be going over the visual spectacle as well as the world building aspects of Paul W.S. Anderson's Monster Hunter. Again, thank you for watching, and until my next video, I will see you all later.